There are plans for a Sega PlayStation. Most people by now have heard the wild tale of the Nintendo PlayStation, a rare prototype that emerged from what was supposed to be a groundbreaking partnership between Nintendo and Sony. This ill-fated console was designed to handle both Super Nintendo cartridges and a proprietary CD-ROM format, with Sony eager to flex its muscles in the gaming industry by pushing its cutting-edge optical disc technology. But what happened next was pure corporate drama in what can only be described as one of the most brutal betrayals in gaming history. Nintendo stabbed Sony in the back in the most public way possible at the end of the 1991 Consumer Electronics Show, just one day after Sony proudly announced their deal with Nintendo. The gaming giant dropped a bombshell. They had secretly partnered with Philips instead for their CD-ROM plans. Furious at being cast aside in spectacular fashion, Sony later decided to enter the console market alone and do things on their own terms. This decision set off a chain reaction that would reshape the gaming industry forever. But before this, there is a middle chapter in this story that is rarely talked about, and that is Sony's Sega proposition. Sure, everyone knows about Nintendo's brutal backstab, but what's often overlooked is Sony's immediate response. Before unveiling the standalone Sony PlayStation, the company went into full-blown revenge mode, exploring every possible avenue to counter Nintendo's betrayal. From alternative collaborations to experimental hardware projects and even flirting with Nintendo's direct rivals, Sony wasn't just licking its wounds, it was plotting the ultimate comeback. A comeback that would heavily involve Sega. So, bearing that in mind, I am Lady Decade, and this is the lesser-told story of the Sega PlayStation, a console that almost existed and would have changed everything. Yes, you heard that right, folks. The Sega PlayStation. This concept is so bizarre that it sounds like a glitch in the timeline, but as weird as that crossover sounds, this very nearly happened. It's weird to imagine an alternative universe where we received classics like Final Fantasy VII, but on Sega hardware. Speaking of this legendary game, you can buy the original, remake, and rebirth all for next to nothing by taking advantage of my affiliate links. In fact, you can get huge discounts on thousands of games, including a massive 43% off the brand new PC version of Rebirth. Happy shopping, and I hope you find some bargains that suit your taste. After experiencing the very public fallout with Nintendo, Sony was out for blood. And if there was one man who knew how to give Nintendo a proper kicking, it was Tom Kalinske, the then president of Sega of America, the same man who had already made life hell for Nintendo in the US market. At the time, Sega's 16-bit powerhouse, the Genesis or the Mega Drive outside of North America, was dominating the United States, fueled by Sonic the Hedgehog's unstoppable rise and Sega's aggressive marketing tactics. As their own slogan said, Genesis does what Nintendo don't. The funny thing about speaking with Sega is that Sony had actually helped shape Sega's biggest rival console in the past. Sony had played a crucial role in the Super Nintendo's development, designing its legendary SPC 700 sound chip, and had initially planned to support the console with a CD add-on before Nintendo's now infamous betrayal. One day, while sitting in his office, Tom Kalinske received an unexpected visit from Olaf Olafsson, the then president of Sony Electronic Publishing, and Mickey Schulhoff, president of Sony America. Rather than focus on small talk, the two men didn't waste any time. They got straight to the point, stating, "Tom, we really don't like Nintendo. You don't like Nintendo. We've got this little studio down in Santa Monica working on video games, but honestly, we're not sure what to do with it. We'd like Sega's help in training our team, and we believe optical discs are the future." To give a little bit more context, by 1991, Sega had already launched the Mega CD in Japan and the CD-ROM add-on for the Mega Drive that was set to debut in North America the following year as the Sega CD. However, despite Sega's bold move towards optical media, the add-on was struggling to find its footing, with a limited software library and heavy reliance on FMV-based games. Given this, it would possibly be in Tom Kalinsche's and Sega of America's best interests to support Sony's Santa Monica studio. After all, if Sony could contribute to the development of new games, it would help bolster the Sega CD's lineup at a critical time, potentially giving the platform the push it desperately needed. Collaborating made a lot of sense. Naturally, Kalinske and Sega of America jumped at the opportunity and agreed to help the studio. Though what is really interesting is that the studio in question wasn't actually owned by Sony at all. Instead, it was Digital Pictures, an independent developer specializing in full motion video games, a genre that Sega was heavily pushing on the Sega CD. Originally, Digital Pictures had been developing games for Hasbro's ill-fated VHS-based console, the Control Vision. When that project was scrapped, the studio pivoted to the Sega CD, bringing its FMV-driven vision to a new platform. They went on to create some of the most well-known FMV titles of the era, including Night Trap and Sewer Shark, games that are still remembered today, though, in all honesty, more for their controversy, campy dialogue and B-movie aesthetics than their actual gameplay quality. In fact, Night Trap was talked about more for promoting so-called gratuitous violence and sexual aggression against women. On this alleged note, the chairman of Nintendo of America at the time, Howard Lincoln, stated that Night Trap has no place in our society and would never appear on a Nintendo system. A massive lie, considering that you can get this game now for the Nintendo Switch, so what a massive tool! During the forgotten periods of cooperation between Sega and Sony, the American branches of both companies recognised that while the Sega CD was a step towards the future, its technology was far from ideal. Slow load times, limited colour depth, and heavy reliance on FMV over true gameplay innovation exposed its shortcomings. It was clear that optical media held massive potential, but to truly succeed, it needed a more powerful, purpose-built system, not just a clunky add-on for aging hardware. As Tom Kalinske would later recall and put it, "We had the Sony guys and our engineers in the United States come up with specs for what this next optical-based hardware system would be." Contributing further to this movement, armed with these new hardware specifications, Olaf Olafsson, Mickey Schulhoff and Tom Kalinske travelled to Japan for a crucial meeting with Ken Kutaragi, the visionary engineer behind the Super Nintendo's SPC 700 sound chip. Kutaragi was the perfect person to have on board, as he had been deeply involved in Sony's early gaming efforts, including the Nintendo PlayStation and the Super NES CD-ROM project, both of which had collapsed after Nintendo's betrayal. Now he was looking for a new way forward, and Sega might have been the perfect partner. This same man, who is now recognised as the father of the PlayStation, was immediately enthusiastic about the idea of working with Sega. He saw it as a brilliant opportunity to push forward Sony's ambitions in gaming while leveraging Sega's experience in the console market. In some ways, this pairing was a sort of dream team. Kutaragi understood the financial risks involved, acknowledging that both companies would inevitably lose money on hardware in the short term. But he had ideas to work around this. His solution? Jointly market a single system, the Sega Sony console, and split any financial losses. By combining Sega's brand recognition and Sony's cutting-edge technology, he thought they could dominate the next generation before Nintendo even had a chance to respond. And just like that, the Sega PlayStation was set in motion. Multiple individuals at Sony were fully on board, ready to bring their ideas to life. Now, all Tom Kalinske had to do was convince his bosses in Japan to give the project the green light. But if you know anything about Sega's internal politics, you already likely know where this story is going. Sega president Hayao Nakayama and the board of directors didn't just reject the proposal, they obliterated it without a second thought, scoffing at the mere suggestion. To Sega's leadership in Japan, the idea of collaborating with Sony on a new console wasn't just absurd, it was downright laughable. To them, Sega was a true gaming powerhouse, while Sony was nothing more than a glorified electronics peddler with zero credibility in the console space. Teaming up with Sony wasn't just unthinkable, it was akin to surrendering their own industry to an unworthy outsider. Sega's top brass had no intention of bowing to a company they saw as irrelevant in the gaming world. Typical Japanese businessman hubris, but what was new? To be fair to them though, Sega of Japan likely harboured the same paranoia as Nintendo, an obsessive need to guard their hardware and software ecosystem, treating third-party partnerships as a direct threat to their control over the industry. The thought of handing even a shred of power to Sony, a corporate giant with deep pockets and global influence, was somewhat of a risk. It was speculated that if Sony got a foothold in gaming and actually succeeded, then what was stopping them from steamrolling Sega out of existence? To Sega's leadership, this wasn't a golden opportunity, it was a Trojan horse, and they had no intention of letting it through the gates. But despite the negatives of teaming up, there was also a lot of upsides that Sega of Japan seemed to have been overlooking too. The very pros Tom Kalinske was so keen to embrace. But blinded by arrogance, Sega didn't just turn Sony down, they slammed the door in their face, oblivious to the fact that they were rejecting not just a mere proposal, but the future of gaming itself. As history shows, this catastrophic misstep set off a chain reaction that would reshape the industry forever. Now having been spurned by both Nintendo and Sega, Sony's frustration hardened into a cold desire for independent dominance. What started as a grudge against Nintendo had evolved into something far more dangerous, an unrelenting drive to take over. Still, this wasn't the only mistake that was made during this period. Around this time, Sega of Japan managed to alienate yet another key figure. Sega of America's second-in-command, Steve Race. Despite his vital role in Sega's US operations, Race found himself routinely dismissed and undermined by Japan's leadership. Yet another casualty of their insular, short-sighted decision-making. So, you can probably guess where this man went. That's right, when Sony came a-knockin', Race didn't think twice. Seeing a chance to be a part of something revolutionary, he wasted no time in jumping ship to help bring Sony's new console to life, a decision that would come back to haunt Sega in the years to come. No one should have been surprised. Sega of Japan had spent years undercutting and disregarding Sega of America's leadership, and Race wasn't just the latest victim of their relentless self-inflicted sabotage. As internal divisions deepened, Sega's arrogance wasn't just costing them talent, it was sealing their fate. Meanwhile, Sega of Japan barreled ahead with its own vision for the next generation. The Sega Saturn, a CD-based console it's believed would solidify its dominance. But while forward thinkers like Tom Kalinske and Ken Kutaragi recognized 3D polygonal graphics as the inevitable future, Sega of Japan refused to see the writing on the wall, stubbornly clinging to its 2D arcade legacy. Rather than embracing the shift, they built the Sega Saturn as a 2D juggernaut, fine-tuned for sprite-based arcade games with 3D capabilities awkwardly bolted on as an afterthought, a fatal design flaw that would cripple the console's future. In the US, 3D gaming was already taking over, with games like Virtua Fighter and Star Fox leading the charge, and the PlayStation generating enormous buzz. This meant that releasing the next-gen console built around outdated 2D technology in a rapidly evolving 3D market wasn't just a misstep, it was commercial suicide. Kalinske saw the disaster coming from a mile away, and history would prove him right. What a mess. During this era, in Sega's frantic bid to outmaneuver Sony and Nintendo, Sega of Japan made another catastrophic miscalculation. They rushed the Saturn to market. Driven by sheer panic at Sony's growing presence, they bet everything on brand loyalty and their arcade pedigree, convinced it would be enough to secure victory, but they couldn't have been more wrong. Just like Nintendo before them, Sega underestimated Sony, and the consequences would be brutal. What Sega failed to grasp was that Sony wasn't just another gaming rival. They were an industrial titan with financial firepower that Sega could only dream of. Unlike Sega, Sony could afford to bleed money in the short term, knowing it would pave the way for total domination later. And when the moment came, they wielded that advantage like a weapon. E3 1995 was meant to be Sega's triumphant moment. They took the stage, brimming with confidence, proudly announcing the Saturn's price, $399. They believed they had pulled off a masterstroke. After all, they had just self-launched the console in North America that very day, months ahead of schedule. Then came Sony's turn. Their presentation? No long speeches, no corporate fluff, just one man stepping up to the microphone.
$299.
The room erupted. It was a mic drop moment, a single number that humiliated Sega, stunned the industry and sent shockwaves through the console war. By this point, the PlayStation had already taken Japan by storm after its December 1994 launch, but its North American debut was still on the horizon. E3 1995 was where Sony struck with surgical precision, undercutting Sega by a full $100, instantly killing any advantage the Saturn's rushed launch might have given them. Before the PlayStation had even hit store shelves, Sega's hopes were dead in the water. Sony's masterstroke wasn't just about pricing, it was a showcase of their marketing brilliance, technological superiority, and sheer financial might. The PlayStation, engineered by Ken Kutaragi and backed by Norio Oga, was not just another console. It was a declaration of war. It was proof that Sony understood exactly where the industry was heading while their rivals remained stuck in the past. Sega and Nintendo, shackled by outdated industry models and a refusal to evolve, couldn't see the shift happening right in front of them. Sony was not just following trends, it dictated them, and by the time their competitors finally realised what had happened, the battle was already lost. Sega's pig-headed refusal to evolve was their death warrant. By failing to build a console that could stand toe-to-toe with the PlayStation, they doomed themselves to a slow, agonising downfall, one that would ultimately drive them out of the hardware business for good. For Sega, it was a humiliating end. For Sony, it was cold, calculated revenge, served with a smirk. The Sega PlayStation never existed. Maybe Sega of Japan thought they had nothing to gain by backing it, but history tells a different story, one littered with catastrophic blunders that cost them everything. Had Sega swallowed their pride and joined forces with Sony instead of arrogantly brushing them aside, the entire gaming landscape might have been unrecognisable today. Who knows, maybe Sega, not Sony, would be sitting atop the industry throne. As stated earlier in the video, it's strange to imagine an alternative universe where classics like Final Fantasy VII launched on Sega hardware. Speaking of this legendary title, you can grab the original, remake and rebirth for next to nothing by using my affiliate link. Plus, there are huge discounts on thousands of games, including a massive 43% off the brand new PC version of Rebirth. Happy shopping, and I hope you find some great bargains, and I'll see you all again in the next video.